The United Nations has accused both Russian and Ukrainian forces of summary executions of prisoners of war. The UN report says that prisoners were subjected to torture, death threats and sexual violence. Remember, Moscow and Kyiv have accused each other of mistreating prisoners of war since Russia invaded Ukraine a year ago. Apart from summary executions, the UN report claimed that the Ukrainian personnel had subjected prisoners of war to death threats, mock executions or threats of sexual violence. The report said that some beatings were purely retaliatory in nature. Meanwhile, detailing abuses by Russian forces, the report stated that Ukrainian prisoners of war had said that they were subject to torture, sexual violence, deprived of food and water, and denied medical attention that sometimes led to death. Ukrainian prisoners reported being beaten with shovels, stabbed, subjected to electric shocks, and strangled. Joining us to discuss the findings of the UN report is Greg Swenson, an international affairs expert. He is joining us from London. Sir, thank you for joining us on the broadcast.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Swenson, Vladimir Putin and Russian forces, have been accused of war crimes in the past. Now, these allegations of summary executions of prisoners of war, not just against Russia, but against Ukraine as well. Does this surprise you?
It really doesn't surprise me. It's one of the inevitable natures of war. War is horrible. War is hell. And I think these things ultimately happen in any conflict. Now, on one hand, I don't want to lean towards moral relativism here. I think if forced, you would have to argue that, Putin is the evil person in this drama. And so, but I'm not surprised that there are allegations on both sides. These things happen. And I wish they wouldn't, but they do. So I'd still err on the side of being more critical on Putin because his abuses have been clearly analyzed by the West, by the press, by the UN. You saw his arrest warrant from the International Court 2 weeks ago. So, I think it's clear that Putin is the aggressor overall, but there are definitely weaknesses on both sides. And you've seen that, with the way that the Ukrainians, have handled the press, freedom of the press, some of the things they've done around the Orthodox Church. No one is perfect here. But again, I don't want to make this, moral relativism.
All right, we'll explore that moral relativism in just a bit. But Mr. Swenson, Ukraine says that it expects that the UN mission will avoid any steps that may be interpreted as equalizing the victim and the aggressor. Do you think that this report does that? Equalizing victim and aggressor?
Yeah, I think they're trying to make that clear and walk the same fine line that I'm trying to walk here too. It is clear that the Russians are the aggressors, that Putin is the aggressor. And so there is some merit to that argument. But again, armies tend to be, to be undisciplined when not managed well, and when there's when there aren't a lot of, supervisory positions that are, meant to reduce the probability of these kind of incidents. So, this is. The Russians are known, historically to prefer order over freedom, is an old saying. And this isn't really demonstrating order by any means. So the Russian senior military and officer ranks have been devastated in the first year of this war. I don't imagine the Ukrainian army has a big bench, a deep bench of senior officers and mid-level officers. So, these are the things that can happen when discipline, is when there's a lack of discipline in a situation like this.
Sir, I want to explore those allegations of torture of prisoners of war a little further. The UN report talks about purely retaliatory beatings, says sexual violence, lack of food and water, and medical attention. These are the allegations against both sides. Are these open secrets in conflict zones, or are these anomalies that are being discovered? Because there are so many laws governing this treatment of prisoners of war, and yet these things are being discovered.
Right. Yeah, it's tough to say, Rohit. There's always going to be rumor, and I think both sides are going to argue the other side is worse. So, it's really difficult. You do have I suppose an allegedly neutral arbiter here in the UN, and I think the UN, has a role. But it's very, you're going to have some he said, she said arguments. It's very difficult to understand what the truth is. I would always argue, in past conflicts, the West, the United States has always taken the high road and are very disciplined about this kind of stuff, in spite of, that no one is perfect. You can make the argument that enhanced interrogation was violating some Geneva Conventions, but, the Geneva Conventions are rules that are almost made to be broken in very intense conflicts like we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, sir. Sir, let's talk about those laws, this Geneva Convention on treatment of prisoners of war. Recently the International Criminal Court also issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. Now this report has come of the United Nations detailing the list of abuses that POWs were subject to. Do these actions by global bodies result in any decisive action? And if not, how can we make them more robust? Because Moscow has called for warrant against Putin. Moscow, in fact, has called the warrant against Putin as void. And in just the last little while, Russia's parliament speaker has proposed banning the activities of International Criminal Court.
Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, I would almost argue that, there's some risk in the international court making these accusations. The United States, for example, is very cautious about being under any kind of control by these international courts. Yes, they go after really bad guys, and I think there's a role for that. But they've also they've also in the past overstepped their bounds and taken political views on controversial topics, of course. But I think they have to be careful with that. So I'm not sure that they're in the best position here to pass judgment, because they've erred in the past. And so it doesn't mean that Putin is right. I'm not making that argument. But I think in this case, it is difficult to really empower an international court. It becomes really just a world court, a globalist court. The UN has many flaws as well. And so, starting with the Security Council that has, a permanent veto from China and Russia. So, these are not perfect institutions. I would argue that, again, Russia and Putin are the aggressors in this war, but that doesn't make it unseemly when people in the West, whether it's the media or politicians, ask questions about the lack of discipline around the armies, but also the open-ended commitment, for whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. I think there's merit to asking those questions. What are the strategic outcomes that we envision here in the West, in the UK and the US, and is there any limit to the amount of arms and money that are sent to Ukraine without a defined plan around that? So I think those questions are valid, and you can ask those questions without being a supporter of Putin by any means.
Sir, you talked about the moral aspect of this conflict, the moral relativism. Now, Ukraine's allies in the West have taken a high moral ground vis-a-vis Russia in this conflict. Now, these allegations that are emerging against Ukraine, do you think the West is going to act on this? Because, many nations, in fact, the global leaders have voiced concerns, as you said. How much weapons are they going to supply to Ukraine after all if this war drags on? And there should be some sort of settlement. Both the leaders of Ukraine and Russia should come on the negotiating table. Now, do you think this can be leveraged by the Western allies of Ukraine to push Ukraine into some sort of negotiations with Russia?
Yeah, they might. It's possible. But I do think there's always going to be some lack of credibility about Russian complaints about Ukraine. I mean, I would start with the Wagner Group. I'm not sure they would have any credibility in making an argument in the West That being said, the pro-Ukraine Western alliance is not really supported, as you know, in the global South. Most of the world's population has not supported Ukraine and the Western sanctions. So, this is not something that is an easy call. I don't think that the possibility of atrocities on the hands of by the hands of the Ukrainian army, I'm not sure that's going to be the top issue that will drive compromise or drive the West or Ukraine, for that matter, to the negotiating table. But I think it's more likely it will be the cost of the war, the death and destruction, especially of civilians, the cost to the U.S. and the U.K., who are really bankrolling the war for Ukraine. You're not seeing the real financial support from the Western European countries. So, these are valid questions. And I think that as long as both sides, refuse to accommodate, then this stalemate will continue. And so I would hope that the West can get Ukraine to at least negotiate some of the borders.
Right, sir. Let's also talk about the China factor very quickly. Beijing has sought to position itself as a neutral party to this conflict, but Xi Jinping met Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Spain's Prime Minister will be visiting Xi Jinping in Beijing in the coming week. Pedro Sanchez has said that he would discuss China's peace plan during the visit. Macron and Ursula von der Leyen are also slated to visit China. Do you think China can rally European nations to come on board on its peace formula?
Well, it depends what that peace formula is. We're very suspicious of the CCP and Xi in these negotiations. Some of the comments he made, with his visit with Putin were very troubling. So I think it has to be treated with some suspicion. But if there can be any negotiating, and if he can, get in, make a decent proposal and get support from the West, I think, the U.S. and the U.K. would be all for that, as long as it's, it's reasonable and it's not in blatant support for Putin and for the cause of defeating Ukraine. So, yeah, I would hope that those visits could yield some constructive, progress toward peace. I mean, I think, nobody will. No, I don't think it would be wise to reject anything that comes from Xi just because it's from Xi, but it has to be treated with suspicion. The CCP and Xi are not known to be particularly honest and credible. So I think, but listen, anything that can, lead to that. And it also brings up another point, Rohit, the trouble, one of the concerns, from some of the objections in the West, notably in the US and the UK again, are that we are depleting our military capabilities by sending munitions and tanks to Ukraine. A lot of those don't make it to the battlefield. They end up being traded.
Yes.
In the arms market, and the Biden's recent defense budget is, in real terms, in inflation adjusted terms, is a cut to military spending. So here we are sending $100 billion to Ukraine, and yet he's cut the military budget by 3%. That is really troubling in a time when there are great suspicions about the intentions of the CCP and China and the PRA in the Pacific. And the world, for that matter. There is definitely some merit to the argument that a defense cut at this time is really a big mistake, and I think that has to be considered in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
All right, Greg Swenson, international affairs expert, thank you for joining us with your perspective from London.
Thank you, Rohit.
And that's it on this discussion. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.